I will not rest until we have delivered the strong, safe, and prosperous America that our children deserve and that you deserve. This will truly be the golden age of America. This is a magnificent victory for the American people that will allow us to make America great again.
A victory for the former President Donald Trump, all but certain, after a crucial Pennsylvania win with Vice President Kamala Harris's path to 270 evaporating. The scores as it stands: 267 electoral votes for Trump, 3 shy of the 270 needed to clinch the victory. Welcome to continuing coverage of election 2024. I'm Danny Berger with Manus Cranny and Lisa Abramowitz in New York. Lisa, the Trump trade's being put on in a big way.
Yeah, it's pretty much everything that everyone was expecting except on amphetamines and goose around the world. What you're seeing right now, the dollar very much front and center, surging the most, going back at one point and looking at the Bloomberg Dollar Index since 2020, March of 2020, at the highest levels in about a year. You could see the 30-year yields climbing almost 18 basis points, also the most in a year, to 4.61%. That comes ahead of a 30-year auction later. But again, this idea that Trump will potentially put on tariffs, will potentially cause inflation to be marginally higher. That is risk off for bonds. And then Bitcoin surging to record highs, $73,837. Russell 2000 futures. I just want to point this out. The fact that they're up 6%, that is the biggest surge in more than a year. They're pointing to potentially a record high. This is everything that everyone thought that it would be. Question is, how long will it take before we get some sort of resetting? What is going to stick and what isn't?
It's a move that just for now keeps building and building. It's the clearing event that Mike Wilson and Morgan Stanley talked about. And it's also gone global, too, Manus. Risk everywhere is being bid.
Yeah, and I think you see that through the FX prism. It depends which capital you actually waking up in this morning. Is it in Kyiv? Is it Putin in Russia? Is it Zelensky? Is it the trade currencies that are most at risk? Is it the yuan and the euro? That's where the ground zero is, because you look at the history of Trump 1, and then reflect on what Trump 2 might mean in terms of tariffs. We saw Europe with 25% on steel, they 10% on aluminium. So you are seeing this pressure. That was, of course, back in 2018. So what is Trump 2 in terms of tariffs? How big could they be? 10, 20%, 60% on China? You know, Trump 2. For one thing, it's going to be more demonstrative than Trump 1. And then you look at China. The risk is this, of course, you see moves in the yuan. What is it that breaks on the yuan? What could bring intervention into some of these markets? We've already heard it from some of the Indonesian central bank talking about this. Yuan is ground zero for tariff risk. Euro also reflected in that. And I think, Danny, the musculature of the dollar is just reflected. The EM currencies are under pressure. So we are on intervention watch as well.
Yeah, that dollar-mex trade really, really painful. Let's just go over the state of play as it stands at the moment. The 2 swing states of Georgia and Pennsylvania, both of them going to Donald Trump. We still await 4 other battleground states: Michigan, Wisconsin, Arizona, and Nevada. Trump only needs one of them to win. The Senate, in the meantime, that gets called early for the GOP. But Lisa, in terms of waiting for a result, it's not the presidency that is taking days, it seems. It is the House that could take days.
The big question right now, is this a red sweep? Is this a Donald Trump victory as well as potentially Senate control? Or is it the whole shebang, right? And essentially, there are 22 races that are in contested areas for the House that still have yet to be called. This was as of about a half an hour ago. Really, we've only heard about 3 of them really having a presumed winner. Here's the issue, and really the notes are flooding in from a number of different people. Michael Zezas of Morgan Stanley saying that united versus divided government is the key to the deficit debate. If you end up with divided government, that could potentially temper some of the rise that we've seen in yields. If not, corporate credit Goldilocks is at risk, and so too is this idea that bonds will eventually get bid up because it could be too much of a good thing, and you could get the no landing reacceleration that some people are thinking about.
Yeah, I know JP Morgan's level for the 10-year, should we get the sweep, is 4.6. We're not too far away from that at that moment at 4.42. Let's get some more of the details of how things have been shaping up over the past 12 hours. Kate Ackley of Bloomberg Government joins us now from Washington. So, Kate, any of that outperformance that people were expecting from Harris, it did not materialize.
It doesn't look like it. I mean, it looks like Donald Trump is poised to have a second administration. And we're also, the Senate was more predictable. This was sort of what the polls were indicating, that the Senate would go for Republicans. We still don't know what the margin will look like, though, because we're still waiting on some of these key Senate races to be called, although they'll likely be called here pretty shortly. The House is another matter. As you mentioned, there are, a couple dozen races that are still too close to be called, and that will determine, does the Republican Party hold all three of these key levers of power, the House, the White House, and the Senate, in the next Congress, or will there be a Democratic House that sort of impedes the Republican agenda to some extent?
And therein lies the point for the markets this morning. Kate, good morning to you, which is the checks and balances. If the House does not flip, there's going to be a lot of horse trading over the tax promises that were made by Trump to the nation on this campaign.
Right, and we know that tax policy is just going to be a huge debate in the next Congress in the new year after the new president is sworn in, because there's a whole bunch of these, going back to the 2017 first Trump administration tax law. A lot of those are expiring. A lot of those provisions are set to expire. And so we know that's going to be front and center on the agenda. If there is a Republican House, Senate, and White House, that tax overhaul debate is likely to look a lot different than if there is a Democratic House. So then you would see, maybe do they just, extend the current, tax, the 2017 tax breaks, and just extend them for a period of time? Or, do they get sort of, does Trump sort of become a deal maker in some way if he does have to deal with a divided government? All stuff that we'll be watching for.
One thing that I find fascinating is just the composition and what we've gotten so far. Danny, to me, the fact that the GOP defeated banking chairman Sherrod Brown in Ohio. This raises a question about deregulation, especially at a time where you see banks absolutely flying on the verdict that we've gotten so far.
Well, you get both deregulation and higher yields helping banks. Lori Calvasine of RVC basically made all of her strategists put together a note and say, what is the biggest risk? What is the biggest thing you're looking for in a Trump? Nearly every single one of them said deregulation and said banks. But on the campaign trail, nothing was said about the banking sector. So this is a case of the market really running with a narrative.
Then this is where the argument comes in, which is the banks had already flown higher on the third quarter results. You had the NIMs driving the banks rather than the deregulation. This is cherry on the top in terms of the propulsion of the banks upwards this morning. Just look at some of them, 5% on JP Morgan. You're looking even at the regional banks as well. So this is about what happens with Basel III, the endgame, and this happens what happens with regulation.
So, Kay, just quickly here, how much control already does Donald Trump have to get his agenda through, given the fact he does have the Senate that will have a lot to do with confirmations, a lot of potentially any appointees? How much does he need that majority in the House?
Well, I mean, the House could stop, the House, if the Democrats have the House, that would be the sort of stopping block for a Trump agenda. So he would have to reach across the aisle. It's likely to be a very, very tight margin, whichever party controls the House. But, in the House, the majority rules. And if it is Democrats, that would be a stopping block for the Trump agenda to that extent.
OK, Kate, we'll check in with you through the morning. That is Kate Ackley there of Bloomberg Government. 10-year is propelling higher this morning. Just take a look at it. We're off the highs of the day. But the question is, of course, the path to the presidency is clear. The Senate is clear. The House remains in question. Derek Halpenny joins us now. Derek, you make this point very, very clearly, which is we have this speed of this clarity that we didn't think that we would have. But it is about checking the rise in the yield if they don't get the House. On a red sweep, so just talk us through the scenarios. Right now, the bond market's topping out. If the House stays with the Democrats, do yields cap out at this level?
Yeah, certainly. I think, the primary policy expectation of a Trump clean sweep for the Republicans would, of course, be the fiscal policy and tax cuts. And that essentially goes away. So from a 10-year yield perspective, that certainly is maybe a 10 or 15 basis point differential. So what we were assuming on a clean sweep would be a 10-year yield jump today of potentially 25 basis points. So, yeah, for sure, if the Democrats win the House, it's a game changer in terms of expectations on debt and deficits going forward.
Well, the other narrative is, of course, we kicked off this show talking about the tariffs, talking about the risk around the world. And the ground zero is in the dollar, the musculature of the dollar, but perhaps the pressure that we're seeing in the euro and in the yuan. Again, it's the same kind of question to you, which is tariffs are something which sit within the White House much more so than within Congress. So the musculature of the dollar, you still think that we can propel higher here on the yuan, higher here against the euro? We've yet to understand the size and scale of the tariff narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. I think from a tariff perspective, I think this administration is going to be different to 2016. In 2016, he waited. He focused on tax first. Obviously, if the Democrats win the House, well, then for sure the tax focus goes away. But even if the Republicans win the House, I think he's going to act pretty quickly on tariffs. We've heard that in communications, indeed, with the Bloomberg interview that we had, where he spoke about, you know, the beautiful word of tariff. So I think he's going to act quickly. The question is it in one big swoop to the levels that he has spoken about, in particular for China, at 60%? I think not, but he will act. He will implement tariffs, possibly 10% across the board, and then threaten and verbalize his plan to do more. And therefore, I think the FX markets price in quite quickly the idea of, you know, the full tariff agenda being implemented. And of course, winning the majority, the popular vote, and this pretty strong mandate, he is going to be very, very convinced on implementing his policies going forward.
And Derek, perhaps
and that means
that's what we're seeing, if I can
from
jump in, that's what we're seeing in currencies, which you were just saying as I jumped in. But elsewhere, you have risk ripping, you have small caps rallying some 6%, you have bond yields pushing higher. When you sort through the moves that we've had overnight, what to you looks logical and what do you think has gone too far?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like if you look, for example, in the G10 space, Aussie's outperforming the rest of G10. The dollar's up across the board, of course, but Aussie's outperforming. Kiwi is outperforming, and then the pound is the third best performing currency. There's a logic there, perhaps, in that we've had some announcements over the last 24 hours from China, where they're talking about having substantial capacity for fiscal stimulus. So the idea here is that China is ready and waiting to counter what potentially is going to happen on the trade side by boosting domestic demand. And that ultimately could be a positive for Aussie and for Kiwi. And then, of course, if you look at the UK, direct exports to the US, 2/3 of those exports from the UK are services. Only 1/3 is goods. So relative to Europe and elsewhere, you could argue that the pound and the UK is better positioned to deal with a goods tariff war relative to some of the others in G10.
Okay, Derek, thank you so much. That is Derek Halpenny of MUFG. And Lisa, again, it looks like ground zero for some of the currency pain might be dollar MEX out down 2.8%. But you do just see this currency volatility dropping across the board because we have a certain result.
So George Cervelis of Deutsche Bank came out with this. We move our year-end euro-dollar forecast down to 105. That's not such a far cry if you take a look at what's happening today. I believe right now it's at 107, massive move. Even without control of Congress, a Trump victory would be decidedly dollar bullish via the impact of tariffs. One thing I find notable in all of the notes that are coming across Wall Street right now, there is a sense of a competing question. Is it tariffs? Is it immigration? Which is going to really drive things? You have TD Securities really honing in on what could happen with immigration, talking about the potential for slower growth and higher inflation. People are going to be sussing this out for a long time to come.
Well, it's going to take time to understand exactly what the policy is. As Derek just said, he thinks it's going to be a straight blanket 10% and then ratchet after that. We know that Trump has history on this, which is saying one thing and executing another, and perhaps stepping back if the markets react viciously. The question is, how much more impact will this have on China if you go for 10%, if you go for 50%? The risk is this: UBS have it in as if they go for 60% tariff on all of Chinese imports, you're looking at growth dropping by over 50%. And this is what it forces the Chinese to do more stimulus in their own backyard, and that is more fiscal support, and that is the kind of counterbalance to the argument.
Again, I go back to the fact, though, that Mexico is perhaps more vulnerable. They are closer to an American trade partner than China is, not to mention all of these companies who just moved their international supply chains to Mexico to try to prevent this very thing from happening?
So the theory right now is just that China is filtering products through Mexico, and that is the fear. We'll have to see how this works out. There's a lot of time before inauguration, and I'm sure we'll get some more color about what the willingness is.
That is perhaps the understatement of the century. We definitely have more to comb through. We'll get more into the politics next on your election 2024 coverage. It's your continuing coverage of the election 2024. Danny Berger with Manus Cranny and Lisa Abramowitz in New York. The risk is bid this morning, and it has been for much of the past few hours. Just look at Russell 2000 futures, a great encapsulation of the Trump trade, up 6.3%, rallying to the highest since November of 2021. Meanwhile, bond yields higher across the curve. But it is a bear steepening. We are witnessing 30-year yields up 18 basis points. We get $25 billion on auction today, Manus, of those 30 years.
Yeah, just what is the tipping point and when does the bond market choke in terms of the fiscal policy? This is all to play for. Let's dig a little bit more into the results. We have our Bloomberg senior editor, Joe Sobchak, now in Washington. We know the Senate. We're waiting on Congress. I think the latest is only 3 of the 22 battleground calls have been made. So when are we going to know the rest of these? And is this going to take a considerable length of time?
Well, it could take some time because California will be sort of the tipping point. There were several competitive races there that will be decisive in who will have the majority in the House. Historically, California has taken some time, up to a week, to get all their votes counted. Given how big the state is, and that will be only exacerbated by the fact that a lot of these races are very close. However, I would point out that there were a lot of predictions that the presidential race would not be known for some time, so we may yet get a bit of a surprise here.
Joe, how much are you watching with respect to only 3 of the 22 up for grabs House seats that have been called so far? Which are the next that you're looking for tea leaves about whether it is a true red sweep?
Well, I think there are a few outstanding in the Midwest, but again, it's going to be the California races that there are Republicans who are running in districts that Joe Biden won in 2020. So that will be the decisive points for the election. And I think that these are Republican incumbents who are being challenged by Democrats for the most part.
Joe, making a generalization, but for the most part, Trump outperformed in many areas. How much do we understand that also trickled down into down ballot races for the GOP?
Well, you know, it is interesting. He did outperform expectations and his 2016 and 2020 and some 2016 as well. But there has been a bit of ticket splitting going on, as we're seeing in Arizona, with Ruben Gallego looking to be victorious, even though Trump is leading in the state. But it certainly helped unseat Sherrod Brown in Ohio. That was going to be an uphill climb anyway, but he had defied gravity previously in a very Republican state. And we are seeing some of the House races in New York that were expected to flip did not. The Democrats did gain a few there, but not nearly as many as they had expected.
Joe, thank you very much for that update. That is Joe Sobchak in Washington, D.C. Coming up, leaders from around the world congratulate former President Trump as he inches closer to a victory. We'll have the details for you next. This is continuing coverage of election 2024. I'm Danny Berger alongside Manus Cranny and Lisa Abramowitz in New York. Let's get you some front page news, a look at what's making headlines around the world. And we start with the BBC. Prime Minister Keir Starmer says that he looks forward to working with Donald Trump. Starmer says that the UK-US special relationship will continue to prosper on both sides. Lisa.
Yeah, next up, let's take a look at what's going on in Israel. Next up, in the Jerusalem Post, Benjamin Netanyahu calling Donald Trump's election victory, quote, history's greatest comeback. He says it is a new beginning for America. And Manis, it is a recommitment to the alliance between Israel and the U.S. A lot of people wondering what this means for that relationship.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are questioning what it means for a number of hot conflicts around the world. Bloomberg leads with Bitcoin, jumping to a record high as Trump heads to victory. Investors expect friendlier U.S. crypto rules under his administration. Bitcoin is viewed by many as the so-called Trump trade. Will there be a strategic fund for Bitcoin? That's the question that goes through everybody's
I have to say,
mind.
Bitcoin really closely all night tracked what the betting markets were doing. And it got it right this time.
Yeah, well, here's the issue, that basically this is a presidential candidate and now potentially or likely president who talked about United States as the crypto capital of the planet and deregulating this industry. He raised a lot of money from them, so a lot of people focusing on just how much higher it could potentially go.
Yeah, one of the cleanest trades really for Trump and trying to price that out. Okay, coming up, we're going to break down some more of this market reaction. We're going to be speaking to State Street's Marvin Loh as risk assets well bid and bonds are sold. From our global headquarters in New York, welcome to continuing coverage of election 2024. I'm Danny Berger with Manis Cranny and Lisa Abramowitz. So President Trump all but clinching the victory. 267 electoral votes, 3 shy of 270. We heard from the former President Trump basically declaring victory. We have yet to hear from Harris, but this market, Lisa, happy to trade in the Trump presidency.
Well, and basically it's been building all night, and the Trump trades are pretty much what we expected them to be. Take a look at that dollar. The Bloomberg U.S. dollar index surging the most at one point since March 2020 at the height of the pandemic, up 1.3%, surging versus the euro, surging versus the yen, surging versus the Mexican peso. Yields also climbing 18 basis points, the 30-year yield 4.6%. How much do we see this continue in a time that people are really wondering about the 1-2 punch of tariffs and then potentially immigration and what that means to potential growth and inflation? Bitcoin, the proxy, as you were saying, surging to a record high of 73,557. This might be the crypto capital of the world, according to Donald Trump, and Russell 2000 futures rising almost 6% to a new record high. If you take a look at what's going on with specific names, there is one in focus. It is Tesla. It is ripping. It is tearing up the screen, up more than 12%, up now more almost 15%, as Elon Musk likely will have a main seat in the White House, at least as an advisor to President Trump. And then if you take a look at the bank stocks, wow. If you take a look at the big banks, they're doing great. If you look at the smaller banks, they're doing even better. JP Morgan, Bank of America, both up 6 to 7 to 8%. And then Citizens and Regions both up more than 8%, nearly 9%. Danny, this is everything that people thought would come to fruition. The question is how long it will last.
Because it's everything people thought would come to fruition, which means that they front run a lot of these moves. Heading into today, a lot of these things were already bid, and they're being bid even more, which begs the question, can it really last?
Well, especially given the fact that Stuart Kaiser of Citi basically says this equity rally, this risk rally will work unless there is one potential risk, or two, but this is the main one, a further surge in bond term premium. That could curtail some of the risk appetite. We've heard that from Priya Misra over at JP Morgan as well. That's what people are looking for. When does this hit a tipping point where suddenly people say the risk reward is becoming uneven across markets?
Well, already for international markets, a stronger dollar is already a problem, Manis.
Look, it depends which capital of the world that you're waking up in this morning. From a security point of view, you're waking up. We have a redhead. It is called, let's interrupt ourselves. It's official. Donald Trump has been elected President of the United States. Multiple networks are calling this. He has taken over 270 in the Electoral College. That is the breaking news headline. Donald Trump is the President of the United States of America 2024. for.
Yeah, we were expecting this, just to give you a sense, just to repeat the comments that he had last night when he did, or this morning, early this morning, at his headquarters in West Palm Beach, Florida. I will not rest until we have delivered the strong, safe, and prosperous America that our children deserve and that you deserve. We are going to help our country heal. We have yet to hear from Kamala Harris, Danny, and that, I think, is one key question as we go forward.
It also did not take too long before these results started running in that Kamala Harris said, I will not be speaking tonight. It was two vastly different moods of celebrating in the Trump camp. And again, it was a market that Manis really was willing to price that in early, and it paid off.
Look, he talks about reinstating the golden age of America, make America great again, fix our borders for every citizen. It was a speech of breadth. I mean, it was a speech for everybody. He praised the MAGA movement as well. So it was a very, very extensive, broad-ranging at West Palm Beach. But let's get to Trump headquarters now. Tyler Kendall is standing by in West Palm Beach in Florida. So we heard from the now president, the next president of the United States of America, a little bit earlier. The question is how much more emboldened he might become. They have the Senate. We wait to hear about the House. But the reaction in Palm Beach tonight, Tyler.
Yeah, hey, Manis. So I was here earlier at the Palm Beach Convention Center where now President-elect Donald Trump declared victory. You noted some of his comments at the top there. He told his supporters that he is leading the, quote, greatest political movement of all time. He then ended his comments with a bid seeking unity, urging Americans to get past their disagreements. However, he did do kind of his signature, what he calls the weave, hitting multiple issues. Notably, didn't hit too much on the economy, which we do know is the #1 issues for voters this election cycle. His vice presidential candidate, now vice presidential-elect J.D. Vance, did join him on stage. He did end his remarks with the economy. You also said it there when we are talking about what a future Trump presidency looks like. He can't do any of his agenda without buy-in from Congress. That is why it is so critical that Republicans were able to flip the Senate last night. The House still too close to call. However, we do know that House Speaker Mike Johnson is still here in Palm Beach. He touched down late last night, coming in from Louisiana when the votes started to come in. And we know he's spending his days making inroads with the Trump campaign.
Tyler, it was an outperformance by Trump in many regards. And early, a couple hours ago, shall we say, early in the morning hours, you get the swing states starting to move to Trump, too, Pennsylvania being one of the more noted ones. When we look back at this campaign in the period, how will we reflect on the polls and the results we got?
Yeah, exactly, Danny. So Pennsylvania in particular, right? We saw Vice President Kamala Harris focus her entire last day before Election Day. Their former now President-elect, I have to get used to saying that, President-elect Donald Trump doing 2 stops there before Election Day. But our Bloomberg News Morning Consult polling repeatedly told us that the economy would be a motivating factor for voters. And if I can, I just want to pull from some of the exit polls that we trust, finding that 48% of those surveyed on Election Day today were concerned about the cost of gas, 51% concerned about the cost of housing. When our Bloomberg News Morning Consult poll consistently told us that former President-elect Donald Trump was polling better when it came to voter confidence on the economy compared to Kamala Harris, those were the types of statistics that we know that the Trump campaign was trying to capitalize on and might give us some insights into what ultimately propelled him, particularly in these battleground states. There's a Bloomberg analysis looking at kind of an uneven recovery when it comes to post-pandemic economies in these battleground states and how that could have played a role in how those voters were resonating the 2 different messages from the campaigns.
Tyler, there's also a demographics question here. There's been a huge divide between men and women, with men disproportionately voting for Donald Trump and women disproportionately voting for Kamala Harris. You've seen Donald Trump pick up some votes with people of color in a number of different places, particularly men. Do we have any sense, and I realize it's still early days, but do we have any sense of how that broke down in terms of turnout, in terms of any shifts for now President-elect Donald Trump?
Right. Well, Lisa, we do know that since we were expecting such a big gender divide, that the Trump campaign was really trying to target these young male voters, which actually normally turn out at lower propensities. They're less likely to vote, partly because our polling shows us that they are more weary of the institutions that they are being asked to participate in. But we really saw the Trump campaign go in all in on them. For example, going on podcasts, clinching that last-minute endorsement from Joe Rogan, sort of bids like that to try to bring them into his campaign. It does remain to be seen as we start to get these results in where those final gender divides and gaps land. But we do know that this was one area in particular that the Trump campaign was trying to harness, and it appears it helped him out.
Tyler, appreciate it. That is Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall reporting live from the Trump campaign headquarters. Again, to reiterate, Trump has surpassed 270 of electoral votes, the necessary number he needs to win. The battleground state that tipped him over the edge, multiple outlets just calling Wisconsin in Trump's favor. This is an outcome that had been expected ever since Trump overtook Kamala Harris in Pennsylvania. And it is a market reaction, Manis, that is not moving that much after it already was, because this is what we expected.
I think such a great deal has already been placed into this market, into the dollar. But the consensus is from everybody on the IB and who we've spoken to is that there's still more to go in this dollar trade. And if you think about it, this is going to be one of the oldest presidents elected. I mean, this is not his first rodeo, so he's much more familiar with the construct of Washington. He has Elon Musk. He's got various people around him. Of course, he's got Supreme Court, a level of immunity, perhaps, that, is a new facet to this as well. He's better equipped. And it's a question now of who he surrounds himself in this cabinet. Who's going to advise him on the scale of tariffs, of the pace of tariffs? Who's going to advise him in terms of how to govern for this next 4 years of the United States of America?
And there's also the key question, is this a true red sweep? Yeah. Or is this just going to be Senate and a presidency, but then we're going to also get the House turning Democrat? There still are, I believe, 19 races that are too close to call in the House that will make the difference about whether or not it is a divided government.
Again, it is a market, though, that is not waiting for that. We are pricing in something close to a red sweep. And on that note, let's bring in Marvin Loh, Senior Global Macro Strategist at State Street, joining us now. Marvin, these moves are serious. At the moment, you have something like a 16 basis point move higher in the 10-year yield, small caps up nearly 6.5%. What to you looks like it might stick, and what looks overdone?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this can stick, to be honest with you. We've been talking about this Trump trade for a while, but the fairly aggressive market reaction shows that investors, while they've been talking about it a lot, didn't know what to put on. And now they know what to put on. So, I think that we're going to unpack the winners and losers in all of this. So I think a lot of this is going to stick. I think the question a lot of us are going to be asking this morning is which ones potentially have either a lot more to move or really doesn't yet reflect the type of administration and the policies of administration, which could be even more significant if we get a red sweep. I think that there's still that part of the equation, which is very, very important.
Well, as Ed Yardeni told Lisa and the rest of the surveillance team, the bond vigilantes are coming out. But Marvin, can this government be moved by the bond market if at the same time we have a day like today where risk is rallying and the equity market looks strong?
Yeah, I mean, there is a level of yields which is going to crack a lot of the other risk assets. Clearly we're not there yet now. Term premium is something that I've talked about with all of you actually over the course of the last several quarters. And if we kind of just look at what potentially might be expensive, we know stocks are expensive by historical standards. We know credit spreads are expensive by historical standards. What we also know is that yields are not anywhere near some of the analogs that we're talking about. We had term premiums that were higher than where they were when the bond market had troubles back in 2023. So, there's scope for further bear steepening, which will get to a point that risk assets pay more attention to.
So that's the point that I think a lot of people are wondering about, Marvin, and I'm glad that you brought that up. We're looking right now at real yields of about north of 2%. And what is that tipping point? The fact that we haven't seen any tipping point, that it's quite the opposite this morning, what does that tell you?
You know what? We have an economy that is giving us a lot of comfort in terms of, really navigating through some of the worst of these recession discussions. I will point out, however, Lisa, that, when we were talking about term premiums, back in October of 23 or so, when the Treasury rearranged their issuance schedule because term premiums got 25 to 30 basis points above where they are now, that's when the market really started to pay attention. I would use all of these markers, if you will, as potential stress points in thinking through this, because we're all just figuring this out. We're really entering a period of both political and economic orthodoxy that is very, very hard to put into the economic models, because some of the some of the discussions are things that we really haven't seen.
Marvin, there's a real question about what we're pricing in this morning as well. Is this just Trump plus Senate, or is this truly a red sweep that's already getting baked into yields?
I think it's just Trump plus Senate, to be honest with you. There is a lot more, I think, economic fragility that we need to talk about with the red sweep, just because the timing of whether or not tariffs come early and how long that might, how growth might get affected both in the short term versus the more intermediate term. All of that does come into play much more so in a red sweep.
So not to interrupt the euphoria of the equity market or perhaps the misery of the bond market, but we have a Fed decision, Marvin, and the market has already begun to reprice less cuts, 100 basis points in terms of cuts. The boomerang that you get with this Trump administration, many people say, is inflation. How much more difficult and how much more capacity does the Fed really have to cut into 2025 facing a Trump presidency?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. Think about how much that changed since Jay Powell met with us 6 weeks ago, when the market was saying that the Fed was going to be able to cut well below 3%, and now we're pretty much pricing 100 basis points of cuts throughout the end of the cycle, and it just really began. So inflation, I do view a lot of these tariff and immigration discussions as inflationary. That's pretty much priced into a lot of the markets at this point. But if we talk about mass deportations and the effect that might have on the labor market, the effect that a labor market which already is still trying to kind of get back to more even keel, there's scope to think that neutral rate is still potentially higher. In other words, less cuts than what the market is saying at this point. It's moved fairly extremely. I think it's probably fair for the discussion at this point. But those first 100 days are going to really create a scope for the Fed to think about what it could do. As far as tomorrow is concerned, the Fed still believes they're restrictive. It's going to be carry on. They really can't set policy on a fiscal situation that they don't know yet. So we're going to get that 25. We're going to get conversations that they're data dependent, which is ultimately what they've said. But really, once they sharpen the pencils, once they understand what the inflation response is going to be, that's when they really think about, do I actually have the 150, 175 basis points that I think I could do, which is what they were saying in September.
Certainly a fog heading into 2025. Marvin, thank you so much. State Street's Marvin Loh, thanks for joining us this morning. Just to recap, Donald Trump has now secured a total of 277 electoral college votes. That puts him over the edge to become the 47th president of the United States. He's won most of the battleground states at this point: Georgia, North Carolina, Florida, 2nd District of Maine, Pennsylvania, and now Wisconsin. We still await Arizona, Michigan, and Nevada, with Trump leading in all of those. This is Bloomberg.
This is continuing coverage of election 2024. I'm Menace Graney, Danny Berg alongside me, Lisa Abramovich in New York. Well, Donald Trump has been elected the 47th president of the United States in a political comeback. Bloomberg's Wendy Benjaminson joins us now from Washington. I look at the exit polls and I say to myself, 45% of the voters out there felt they were financially worse off. He picked up more Black and Latino voters despite everything that's happened on this campaign trail. What is it on their messaging and their operation that you think worked better than the Democrats?
I think he focused on the economy and immigration relentlessly. Even when he went on, Donald Trump, even when he went on his long rambling rallies talking about electrocution and sharks and silly things like that, he blamed the economy on the post-COVID economy, on Joe Biden and then on Kamala Harris, relentlessly. He blamed immigration on the two of them relentlessly. And the Democrats' message, while they did talk about the economy to a certain extent, Kamala Harris rarely talked about immigration except to say she would sign the bill that Donald Trump had killed last year in Congress. And she talked about what an awful person she believed Trump was. She called him the fascist after his former chief of staff did. And that message has now proven over two presidential cycles, that message, Donald Trump is awful, doesn't work. You have to give voters a plan to vote for. Donald Trump did that, and I'm not sure that Kamala Harris successfully didn't do that.
Wendy, a lot of people were saying that a lot of this came down to turnout, and a lot of this came down to, in particular, the gender divide. And I keep going back to that. I'm looking right now at exit polls from NBC News talking about men 44% voting for Kamala Harris and 54% voting for Donald Trump. Is there any sign or any evidence that there was a stronger male turnout after traditionally flagging, particularly behind women?
Yes, I think there was. I think his message, to young men, to Latinos, to black voters was successful again because he talked about the economy. And Lisa, one of the things that just blew my socks off, surprise, was that even in states where abortion rights referenda succeeded, Donald Trump still won. So we were all expecting that any place where there was an abortion rights referenda that expanded abortion rights for women, that would carry Kamala Harris across the finish line in those states. In Arizona, it did not. And in other states, it's not happening that way either. And so, and Donald Trump also fared better in the suburbs than we expected him to fare. And that may be that there were conservative women who decided to vote for Donald Trump anyway. But he also outperformed Democrats with Latino voters. And that's another thing I believe Democrats will be studying as they gaze at their navels after this and figure out what the heck happened, which is that Donald Trump captured about 45% of the Latino vote, which is he was up 10 points with Latino voters this time. Biden was up 23 points with Latino voters, and Hillary Clinton was up 31 points with Latino voters. So Democrats are losing the Latino vote, and I think it's, again, because they're not focusing on the economy, which is important to every voter, regardless of their ancestors' country of origin.
A real postmortem to come. Wendy, we appreciate it. That's Wendy Benjaminson in Washington. This is Bloomberg. This is continuing coverage of election 2024. Donald Trump declared the winner, and it will be the next president of the United States. Lisa, this market is moving. Small caps up 6.5%, 10-year up 16 basis points. Marvin Loh of State Street saying not only will much of this stick, it could go further if there's a red sweep.
Which raises some real questions for the bond market. I'm looking right now at 30-year yields up almost 20 basis points with an auction coming at 1 p.m. How much further does that have to go?
Ground zero is the euro and the yuan. If you look at it from the global perspective, what kind of tariffs will be brought to bear? Is it going to be a blanket 10% and then see it from there? And what will the Chinese have to do to retaliate? That's it from the coverage today in New York.